Chapter 10. It took them 40 minutes, once they left the park, to walk to the Place de Bordeaux. Every taxi was taken and there were few other vehicles on the road. By the time they got to the shelter of the tram stop at Lycée Kléber, they were both soaked through and frozen numb. At the north end of the square was the Holiday Inn, and beyond that the Palais des Congrès. Kirsty was unable to bring herself even to look in that direction. She was unable either to stop shivering, and Enzo stood holding her in the dark, miserable and bewildered and depressed. The digital display overhead told them that the next tram would be in 3 minutes. With fingers that had lost all feeling, he fumbled to use a credit card to buy them a ticket from the machine. After the third rejection, he tried another card, and still the machine wouldn't accept it. Neither would it accept any of Kirsty's cards. He cursed and felt like kicking the damn thing. They had no cash, and so they would have to ride the tram without tickets. Maybe they'd be arrested and thrown in jail. At least it might be warm there. They waited alone in silence until the lights of the tram emerged from the darkness, its bell ringing as it rattled across the junction. There were only a handful of other passengers on it. They cast disinterested glances at the cold, unhappy couple who got on board at the Lycée Kléber and sat side by side without speaking. The tram creaked and strained and wound its way south along the Avenue de la Paix, around the Place de la République, and then east towards the Place de l'Homme de Fer, which translated, curiously, as Iron Man Square. There they reluctantly stepped back into the icy blast, sheltering beneath a strange, circular construction of steel and glass, then out into the snow again, huddled together, crossing the bridge on the Rue de Sébastopol to the Place des Halles, where the Hotel Ibis rose high into a snow-smudged sky above the incongruously British C&A department store. Enzo was already dreaming of a hot shower as they climbed the steps opposite the Lion d'Or Chinese restaurant, and glass doors slid aside to draw them into the warmth of the hotel reception. "I have a reservation, 2 rooms under the name of MacLeod." The girl behind the desk tapped on her keyboard and scrutinized her screen. "I'm sorry, monsieur, we've given those rooms away." Enzo stared at her in disbelief. "What? Why?" His hot shower was suddenly fading into an uncertain future. "I'm afraid your credit card was rejected." Enzo snorted his frustration. He had given them the number over the phone. "That's not possible. There must be a mistake." He fished in his wallet for his card. "Here, try it with the actual card." "I'm afraid it won't make any difference. The hotel is full." "Just try it, will you?" Enzo snapped at her, and she winced, but decided not to argue. She slipped the card into the machine. He tapped in his code. They waited, and then she shook her head with an undisguised pleasure. "I'm sorry, monsieur. It's still rejected." He sighed heavily and gave her another card. "Try with this one." The girl set her jaw in sullen acquiescence, and they went through the same procedure again. The second card was also rejected. Kirsty pushed a card at the girl. "Try one of mine." The same thing. Enzo looked at his daughter. "So it wasn't a faulty ticket machine at the tram stop. It was our cards." He waved his hands in frustration. "All of them! Well, that can't be a coincidence. Like the mugging in the park that left us without any cash. We're being shafted, Kirsty. Royally screwed." The girl behind the desk smiled at them with an infuriating smugness. "I'm sorry. Like I said, the hotel is full. I'm going to have to ask you to leave." Outside, Kirsty fought to hold back the tears. She was very close to the end of her tether, and Enzo wasn't far behind, but crying about it wasn't going to help. She went into her purse in search of her cell phone. "I'm going to call Roger." Enzo felt an irrational spear of anger jab at him through his misery. "Why? What can Roger do? He's in Paris." "He can use his credit card to book us into a hotel by phone, and maybe he can come and get us in the morning." Enzo cast her a surly look. To involve Raffin would be like admitting that somehow he had failed. Good old Enzo, charging to the rescue and falling flat on his face. But right now he couldn't think of a viable alternative. They sat in a bar nursing coffees paid for with a handful of coins they had managed to scrape together from pockets and purses. Enzo stared morosely out into the street, watching each passer-by on the sidewalk, wondering if any one of them might be the stranger who was so efficiently deconstructing their lives. He tried not to listen as Kirsty explained their predicament to Raffin. He could just imagine how the young Parisian journalist would interpret their circumstance as somehow being Enzo's fault. He could picture the look of supercilious superiority on the face of his daughter's lover. And then they waited, for nearly half an hour before Raffin phoned back with the news that he had found them rooms at the Hôtel Régent in La Petite France. The River Isle divided in the centre of Strasbourg, sending a loop around the very heart of the old city before it rejoined the main flow a couple of kilometres downstream. So the original medieval city centre, with its cathedral and 6 churches, was effectively an island. The east end of the island, with its wharves and waterways and ancient, narrow streets, was known as La Petite France. Once home in the Middle Ages to the city's merchants and burgeoning middle class, it was now its main tourist attraction, filled with restaurants and hotels and souvenir shops. Enzo and Kirsty turned down through a deserted square, the last customers sitting in the window of a vegetarian restaurant, a 17th-century house on 3 floors. White painted wattle and daub transected by ancient oak beams was in the process of renovation. Staff were washing out the kitchens in the Maison des Tanneurs restaurant, with its Alsacienne specialties of choucroute and tarte flambée. It exhaled tantalizingly warm air at them as they passed. A revolving bridge led them across the river to where the Hôtel Régent had established itself in an old mill which had once served tanneries lining the riverbank. As they trailed across the foyer to the reception desk, wretched and cold, Enzo noted with some satisfaction that a room cost nearly €300 a night, and petit déjeuner another 20. Raffin will be less than happy with a bill on his credit card of more than €600. Their rooms were high up in the roof, with windows overlooking the water below, cut deep into steeply sloping walls, washed by subtly concealed lighting. The original supporting beamwork was painted white. Enzo carried Kirsty's bag into her room, and they shed sodden coats. She went into the bathroom to fetch towels and threw him one to dry his hair. He perched on the luggage rack at the end of her bed, weary and defeated, and loosened his hair from its band before rubbing it briskly with a towel. His skin was stinging in the warm air of the hotel room. He looked up and saw that Kirsty was flushed, and that her eyes were raw and puffy. He stood up. "Come here," and she dropped her towel and let him fold his arms around her. "We're going to be all right." He wanted to say that they should make the most of their time together because there was so very little of it left, but he didn't have the heart to tell her that he was dying. "Have you finally forgiven me?" he whispered, and she immediately drew away. She looked at him with a strange, distant hurt in her eyes, like a pet dog that has just been kicked by its trusted master. "No," she said simply. "I'm not sure I can ever do that. You stole half my childhood, and that's not something I can ever get back." He wanted to tell her it wasn't like that, but there didn't seem any point. Linda had used her as a weapon against him, and ended up poisoning her own child in the process. All he could think to say was, "I'm sorry," as he had said 1,000 times before. "If I could do it all again—" "You'd what? You wouldn't leave us for your French lover?" "I never left you. If I could have taken you with me, I would." But in his heart of hearts he knew that even if he could have done it all again, he would still have left for Pascal. And as he looked his daughter in the eye, he knew that she knew it too. She said, "When you came back into my life, you brought the pain back with you. And I had to confront the realization then that the reason it hurt so much was because I loved you, and still do, even if I can't forgive you." They were both startled by the shrill ring of his cell phone. The emotion between them dissipated like smoke in the wind. He glanced at the display and saw that it was Sophie, and he realized the irony in that. She was jealous of Kirsty and the place that her half-sister had in her father's heart. She might have taken some satisfaction from knowing that she had interrupted an intimate moment between them, but the thought quickly vanished when he heard the distress in her voice. "Papa, there's been a disaster." "What is it, Sophie? What's happened?" He glanced up to see Kirsty watching him with her mother's dark eyes. "There was a fire tonight. Bertrand's gym's been burnt to the ground." Enzo closed his eyes and felt Bertrand's pain. At first he had disapproved of his younger daughter's boyfriend. He was 7 years older than her, wore studs and earrings, and gelled his hair. But time had revised first impressions, and Bertrand had earned his grudging respect. He knew how much the gym meant to the boy, how he had held down 2 jobs to pay off the loan he had taken to convert the old Miraterie into a successful gymnasium, how he had worked to graduate from the Krebs Centre in Toulouse with his diplôme in musculation, all the while supporting his widowed mother. "Is he okay?" "He closed up about an hour before it happened. We heard the fire engines before we saw the light in the sky. Someone phoned to say it was the gym." He heard the catch in her voice. "We stood on the Pont de Cabessu and watched it burn." "He's insured, though, yes?" "Papa, you know how long that'll take to pay out. Bertrand doesn't know what he's going to do. He'll have to find the money to repay all the customers who've paid subscriptions." He could tell that she was on the verge of tears. "Papa, where are you?" "I'm still in Strasbourg." There was a strange moment of silence, and then her voice fell away to barely a whisper. "The police have been looking for you." "What? Why?" "They wouldn't say. They've been at the door twice, several of them. Papa, it wasn't a social call. I told them you'd gone to Strasbourg, but they didn't look like they believed me when I said I didn't have an address." Enzo was suddenly on full alert, his mind working overtime, slicing through the fatigue, making connections, drawing unpleasant conclusions. "Sophie, I want you to leave the apartment immediately. You and Bertrand pack a bag each. Get him to take you to Nicole's father's farm in the Aveyron. You know where it is, don't you?" "Papa, why?" He heard the alarm in her voice. "Just do it, Sophie. Trust me. It may be that the fire at the gym wasn't an accident. It's possible that there's a connection with what's been happening here in Strasbourg." "I don't understand." "You don't need to. Just believe me when I tell you that you could be in danger. I'll call Nicole's papa to tell him you're coming." When he hung up, Kirsty was looking at him perplexed. "How can a fire in Cahors be connected with someone trying to kill me here?" Enzo met her gaze with a steady intensity. "I'm beginning to think that what's happened in Strasbourg isn't about you at all." "I think someone trying to kill me is very much about me." He shook his head. "No, there's too much else going on. The mugging in the park, the credit cards, yours and mine, Bertrand's gym burning down, the police looking for me." "What do the police want you for?"
"I don't know. But I think there's a good chance that none of this has anything to do with you, or Bertrand, or Sophie. I think this might be about me."
She looked at him long and hard, then picked up the towel she had dropped on the bed. She sighed wearily.
"It's always about you, Dad, isn't it? Always has been, always will be."
She turned towards the bathroom.
"I'm going to have a shower. You can let yourself out."
Chapter 11. Yellow light reflected darkly off polished wooden floors. Rusted cogs and wheels and screws dipped down into dark waters behind glass walls, the machinery that once powered this old mill. There was only one other person at the bar, a woman nursing a champagne flute of pale, sparkling Dom Perignon. Enzo hoisted himself onto a stool at the far end next to a large glass bowl filled with champagne bottles cooling in ice. The room was illuminated by the upward glow of backlit sheets of wafer-thin marble that dressed the bar. He ran his eye along glass shelves lined with bottles. Although the hotel promoted this as a champagne bar, it had a decent selection of whiskies. He ordered a Glenlivet from a bored-looking young barman who poured him a large measure and then retreated to polish glasses at a discreet distance. Enzo slumped over his drink for some time, simply looking at it, trying to find solace in its pale amber. But it wasn't the colour that would bring comfort, it was the alcohol. And if not comfort, then perhaps oblivion. A painful journey on which he seemed reluctant to take the first step. And so he continued to stare at it, fighting to keep conflicting and unpleasant thoughts from his mind.
"It'll evaporate before you drink it."
He looked up to see the only other customer regarding him with a quizzical smile. Until now he had paid her no attention. But looking for the first time, he saw that she was attractive. Not in a pretty way, but with a strong jawline and well-defined cheekbones. Her eyes were dark, almost black, and she had an unusually small mouth with full lips, until she smiled, and it was a smile that split her face. Long, silky brown hair was pulled back from her face and piled up loosely, untidily behind her head. She was a woman well past the first flush of youth. Enzo thought she could be around 40, tall and lean, but she dressed younger. A short black leather jacket, jeans and sneakers, and not a trace of makeup, which was unusual for a woman of her age. She was either supremely self-confident or simply didn't care. Her skin was tanned, as if she had just spent time somewhere in the sun, and examining her hands he saw that they were strong and elegant, with unpolished nails cut short.
"Maybe that's what I'm waiting for."
"Why would you do that?"
"If I drink it, I'll only order another."
He held her gaze for a moment, then returned it to his drink. He reached for the water jug, poured in a little water to release the flavour locked into it by the distiller, then filled his mouth to let it slip slowly over his throat. The aromatic flavour of it filled his nostrils, and its warmth burned all the way down into his chest. It felt good, but there was a long way to go before he would find the solace he sought.
"You know, it's funny."
He looked up, surprised to find her still watching him. He had almost forgotten her already.
"What is?"
"It's not often that I find myself alone in a bar, and not be pestered by some man."
"You should make the most of it, then. Some man might come in at any moment and try to pick you up."
She gave a small shrug of resignation. It seemed that Enzo was not going to be the one to try.
"I guess maybe I'm getting to an age where men just stop noticing me."
Enzo found a smile from somewhere.
"They'd have to be pretty blind."
He took another mouthful of whiskey.
"Don't be offended. It's not you. It's me."
She cocked an eyebrow. Gay? Which made him laugh unexpectedly.
"No, it's just I have other things on my mind."
"A problem shared is a problem halved."
"Two swallows don't make a summer."
For a moment her forehead creased in a frown, and then she saw what the game was, and a smile snuck across her lips.
"Two minds are better than one."
"An empty barrel makes the most noise."
"Wise men agree, and fools seldom differ."
But now his smile was strained. The game was already losing its power to distract, puerile and pointless. He had come here to get drunk. He drained his glass and ordered another. She watched in silence as the barman refilled his glass, then she ordered another glass of champagne for herself. When the barman had poured it, bubbling to the rim of her glass, she lifted it and moved along the bar, slipping onto the stool next to Enzo. On another day, in other circumstances, he might have felt a tiny frisson of sexual excitement. Instead he felt that she was encroaching on his space, and he might have resented that. Except that she didn't give him the time.
"Why don't I buy you that one? I'll do the talking, and maybe that'll take your mind off whatever's worrying you."
He was surprised for the second time by the smile that found his lips.
"Never fails."
"What?"
"Every time I go into a bar on my own, I get pestered by some woman."
It was her turn to laugh.
"Then I should introduce myself. That way I won't just be some woman."
She held out her hand.
"Anna."
He hesitated for just a moment before taking it.
"Enzo."
Her handshake was firm and warm.
"Women adore me."
She grinned.
"Oh, do they?"
She tilted her head, and her look became appraising.
"Maybe I can see why." She paused. "Different-coloured eyes. Very unusual."
"Vardenberg syndrome goes with a white stripe in the hair."
"Is it fatal?"
He flicked her a look, but of course there was no way she could have known.
"Not the Vardenberg, no."
He drained his glass and felt the alcohol going straight to his head. He had still not eaten since breakfast. He waved the barman to refill the glass.
"Put them all on my room,"
she told the barman. She sipped her champagne and looked at Enzo speculatively.
Enzo. Short for Lorenzo, right? But you don't sound Italian.
Scottish.
And what brings you to Strasbourg?
I thought you were going to do the talking.
Well, I'll tell you what brings me to Strasbourg, but you probably wouldn't be interested.
Try me.
Parents,
she said, and she pursed her lips in a smile of regret.
Elderly and failing, and full of recriminations about the daughter who doesn't come to see them often enough.
Why's that?
Because I'm never here.
In Strasbourg, or in France?
Both. I'm a ski instructor, based in Switzerland in the winter. I spend summers in the Caribbean, teaching scuba diving, which keeps me fit for the winter months.
In spite of all the thoughts crowding an already overcrowded mind, Enzo finally found himself interested. Distracted.
How does someone become a ski instructor? There's not much else to do when you can't compete at the top level anymore. You were a professional. Skied for France in 2 Olympics. Didn't win any medals, but I made the top 10. Trouble is, the body starts to decline just as the brain starts to develop. The intrinsic contradiction faced by every athlete. When you're young, the flesh is willing, but you lack the experience. When you have the experience, the flesh is no longer willing. Et voilà. Those who can, do, and those who can't, teach.
A bird in the hand's worth 2 in the bush.
Her smile was a patient one.
We're not going to start that again, are we?
Not if you don't want to.
He sucked down more whiskey.
So where to now? Switzerland?
Too early. The season's not properly underway yet, and my contract doesn't start for another month. I'm heading up into the Auvergne for a few weeks.
Pretty bleak up there at this time of year.
That's how I like it. English friends are lending me their holiday house. It's near a tiny village, lost in the hills somewhere to the east of Aurillac. My sanity saver.
You're going up there all on your own?
She shrugged.
No one else to share it with.
She sipped at her champagne and stared into the endless stream of bubbles rising through her flute to break the surface.
Funny. I never imagined I'd make 40 and still be on my own.
Enzo said,
I've been on my own for 20 years. You get used to it.
She looked at him curiously, then slipped her hand very gently over his.
No one should have to be on their own, ever. Life's too short for that.
He turned towards her, to find a strange dark intensity in her eyes, something almost sad, compelling. And he felt a flutter in his stomach like startled butterflies. She had no idea just how short. The lights of La Petite France reflected off the water below, projecting flickering, amorphous images through the arched window and onto the far wall of Enzo's bedroom. By its monochrome light he watched as Anna slipped off the T-shirt she wore beneath her leather bomber and shimmied out of her jeans, until she stood in just black bra and panties, tall and elegant, with an almost boyish figure. Her skin was clear and tanned and smooth, and she moved with an innate grace towards the bed, the sure-footed balance of the skier in every step, dropping her bra on the floor to reveal the curve of small, firm breasts with dark, succulent areolae. She kicked off her pants, and he saw the thin strip of her Brazilian waxed pubis below the belly. Then she released the clasp behind her head to let her hair tumble freely across square shoulders. In all his wildest imagination he could never have foreseen this when he boarded the train in Cahors yesterday. And yet there was something about it that felt just right. To make love to a stranger on the eve of his death. No promises made and none to keep. Perhaps the last time he would ever make love to a woman. But it wasn't the sex, although she had succeeded in arousing powerful sexual instincts within him. It was the human contact, skin on skin, the warmth of another person wrapped around him, comforting, consoling. A moment without past or future. She straddled his chest, leaning over him, her breasts inches from his face, to release his hair and fan it out across the pillow. Then she dipped to kiss his forehead, his nose, his lips. Gentle, intimate kisses, as if they had known each other all their lives. She ran fingertips through the hair on his chest and slid down until her lips brushed his belly, and he felt the rush of blood to his loins. He ran his hands down her back, feeling smooth, firm muscles beneath his palms, and cupped full buttocks before turning her over, taking her by surprise, driven by sudden lust. She gasped as she felt his erection press hard against her belly, and he found her lips and tongue with his mouth to silence her. His fingers sought the soft, wet place between her legs and grazed her repeatedly until she arched against him, and he slid down to bite her nipples and tease them with a darting tongue. He felt her fingers digging into his back, and through palpitating breath heard her whisper, "No, please, no." When it was over, he was spent in a way he had never known before, fatigued beyond reason in body and mind. He wanted to weep, to tell her everything, about Kirsty and Sophie and Pascal, and the sentence of death which had been passed on him just yesterday. But these were secrets best kept, secrets that he would carry with him to the grave. She lay beside him, curled into his hip, her breath on his shoulder, her hand on his belly, and he felt her take comfort in him. She, too, had her secrets, stories she would never share, a sadness behind dark eyes that she would never breach. He leaned over to kiss her forehead, before closing his eyes to slip away into an unexpectedly deep sleep. Chapter 12. It was raining, as it always seems to be. He was at a funeral, a Gaelic funeral, like they have in Scotland, the coffin resting on the backs of 2 chairs set out in the street. He was one of the bearers, dressed all in black. The women watched as the coffin was lifted and the long walk to the cemetery began. They would not follow, for the women were not allowed at the graveside. As they came over the top of the hill, the bells of the church ringing in their ears, they saw the gravestones, like so many cropped stalks on the macha below, and he couldn't stop himself repeating the lines of the poem by John Donne. And therefore send not to know for whom the bell tolls. It tolls for thee. Over and over, like a mantra, penetrating his soul. The bearers were soaked through by now, and his hands had become wet and slippery. He found that he could no longer keep his grip. Again and again he moved his hands to try to secure a firmer hold on his corner of the coffin, but it was slipping away from him, heavy and awkward. He called for help, but it was too late. It slid from his shoulder and pitched forward to the hard earth. There was a loud crack, and the polished wooden box split open, spewing the dead man from its silk interior to a grotesque final resting place on the metalled surface of the road. Enzo watched in horror as the corpse rolled in slow motion towards him, a face like death itself, eyes wide and staring, a purple bruised tongue protruding from pale lips, and he realized that he was looking at himself. He woke up, still gasping from the shock of it. Bedsheets damp and twisted around his body. His hair was in his eyes and his mouth. He sat up and swept it from his face, breathing hard, unable to shake off the knocking sound in his head, loud and insistent. A grey morning light filtered from the semicircular window that overlooked the mill pond below, and he realized, finally, that someone was knocking at the door. And suddenly he remembered Anna, and making love to her the night before, and he turned towards her, but the bed was empty, cold. She was long gone, like a dream. Perhaps, after all, she had really only been a figment of his imagination. He slipped from the bed, a painful consciousness slowly returning, and pulled on a toweling bathrobe. The rich red carpet felt soft under his feet as he walked to the door and opened it. Raffin had his hand raised, ready to knock again. Kirsty was at his shoulder. "For heaven's sake, Dad, why didn't you answer? We thought something had happened to you." She pushed past the journalist and into the room. Raffin followed and closed the door behind him. Enzo was still sleep-confused.
I was sleeping."
He looked at Raffin.
"When did you get here?"
"I got the 6 o'clock TGV from Paris." He didn't look as if he had risen early. As usual, he was immaculately groomed, Clean-shaven, his hair a shining brown, swept back to the fashionably upturned collar of his linen jacket. His pale green eyes regarded Enzo speculatively.
"You sleep pretty soundly for a man whose daughter's life is under threat."
Enzo looked for his watch, but his wrist was naked.
"What time is it?"
"Nearly 9. Kirsty stooped to pick up Anna's meagre black bra. She looked at her father in disbelief.
"What's this?"
There was something like a smirk on Raffin's face.
"Well, it doesn't look like it would fit your father."
Kirsty turned her consternation in Enzo's direction, but before he could think of anything to say, the bathroom door opened, and a startled Anna stood in the doorway, a bathrobe hanging loosely on her angular frame, a towel wrapped around wet hair.
"Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't realize there was someone else here."
Enzo glanced with embarrassment towards his daughter and saw anger and humiliation blazing in her eyes. Raffin stepped in quickly.
"We were just leaving."
He took Kirsty's arm and led her firmly out into the corridor. He cast Enzo a parting glance that seemed to carry the conflicting attributes of both admonition and admiration. When the door shut, Enzo turned sheepishly towards Anna.
"I thought you'd gone."
"Who were they?"
"The girl's my daughter, Kirsty. Raffin's her boyfriend."
Something in his tone made her cock an eyebrow.
"You sound as if you don't approve."
She began gathering her clothes together.
"I don't."
"And does her mother share your view?"
"I wouldn't know. I divorced her more than 20 years ago. Kirsty's never forgiven me."
"Ah."
"What does that mean?"
"Just, ah."
She clutched her clothes to her chest.
"I think I preferred it when we didn't know too much about one another, and I certainly don't want to get between a father and his daughter."
She gave him one of her sad smiles.
"I think I'd better go."
She crossed the room to give him a tiny, soft kiss on the lips.
"I loved making love with you last night."
And then she hesitated.
"Although you should know, I'm not in the habit of sleeping with strangers."
She closed her eyes for a fleeting moment of introspection.
"I was feeling pretty low, too. Maybe fate brought us together just to take the pain away for one night."
He nodded.
"Maybe."
She looked at him long and searchingly, and he thought that whatever pain it was that she was suffering, it brought a kind of tortured beauty to her face. She crossed to the dresser and laid her clothes in the chair and lifted a hotel pen from the desk. She turned a pad of letter-headed notepaper towards her and scribbled a quick address and phone number. She tore it off and held it out towards him.
"That's where I'm staying for the next few weeks, if you get lonely."
He took it almost absently, folding it and slipping it into the pocket of his robe.
"Sure,"
he said, knowing that he would never see her again. She lifted her clothes and headed for the door. A fleeting backward glance, and she was gone. Chapter 13. The dining room, behind long net drapes, doffed its cap to the colours and culture of the 60s. Red leather chairs and black steel tubing, faux wood-grain formica veneer and shaggy grey carpet. Hotel guests dipped croissants in steaming black coffee and tried to give the impression that they couldn't hear Kirsty railing at her father. Her voice was shrill and filled with accusation, despite Raffin's best attempts to calm her down. He disliked scenes.
"Someone tried to kill me a couple of days ago. I'm being stalked by the man who was almost certainly responsible for that. The same man who probably broke into my apartment and set a bunch of kids to steal our money in the park. The same man who somehow fixed it that all our credit cards are out of credit."
She drew a deep breath for the denouement.
"And all you can think to do is pick up some woman in a bar to follow your dick, just like always."
Raffin was shocked.
"For God's sake, Kirsty."
He glanced anxiously at the heads turning in their direction. But she was past caring. This was betrayal. This was the man in whom she had put her trust, the man she had turned to for help when her world was crashing around her, and while she was crying herself to sleep in the room next door, her father was screwing some woman he'd just picked up in a bar. It was unforgivable. Enzo saw the pain in his daughter's eyes, the absolute belief that somehow he had let her down. And maybe he had. Maybe he always had. But with the selfishness of a child, she never made any allowance for the feelings of others. He shook his head.
You don't understand.
No, I don't, and I don't want to.
Well, maybe that's part of the problem. You don't know me. You've never wanted to know me.
Oh, and you know me, do you? You weren't around for most of my life, so how's that possible?
She was right on the edge, breath coming in short, sharp bursts. Enzo stared at her. Anger, frustration, guilt, all boiling together inside him.
You've spent 20 years blaming me, for all those little things that didn't please you, for every unhappiness you ever felt. It was my fault, never yours, never your mother's, always mine. You've defined your entire life by blaming me for everything that's wrong with it. Well, you're going to have to find someone else to blame pretty damn soon, and maybe that's a good thing, because when I'm not around any longer, you won't have some convenient scapegoat to blame for your own shortcomings, and maybe, finally, you'll start taking responsibility for yourself.
He screwed up his napkin and threw it on the table. Almost on the verge of tears, he stood up, turning abruptly through the net curtains and striding away across the marble foyer. Kirsty was stunned to silence. She had never been on the receiving end of her father's ire, never felt the full force of his hurt and frustration, and it took a moment before the implications of what he had said fully sank in. She turned to search Raffin's pale green eyes for reassurance, but found only embarrassed bewilderment. Colour had risen high on his cheeks.
What did he mean?
Raffin shook his head.
I've no idea.
Kirsty rose quickly, nearly upsetting the table, and went chasing through the columns after her father. The elevator doors were closing by the time she reached them. She got a hand in just in time, and they slid open again to reveal Enzo standing alone under the harsh electric light. He looked tired, washed out, dark shadows beneath his eyes, diminished somehow. And almost for the first time in her life she saw him as being old, failing, less than the image of tall, youthful strength she had carried with her since childhood. The doors slid shut, and they rose slowly together through the old mill in an awkward silence that neither knew quite how to break. Finally she said,
"What did you mean? You wouldn't be around any longer?"
He pursed his lips.
Nothing.
It didn't sound like nothing to me.
A ton of phrase.
Bullshit.
He looked at her and found himself speared by her dark, searching eyes. He might have resisted a little longer, kept his secret to himself, a little ball of poison screwed up inside of him, but there didn't seem any point any more. She would find out soon enough. They all would.
I'm dying.
2 simple words, dropped like toxic pearls into a young life that had never contemplated a world without him. He was right. She had used her anger at him to define everything about herself. When she had failed, it was his fault. When she had succeeded, it was to show him that she didn't need him. But she did. She heard her own voice like a whisper in the dark.
How? Leukemia. They say I've got 6 months if I take the chemo, but I'm not going to do that.
Why?
It's been a checkered life, Kirsty. I've known pain and tragedy, sure, but I've loved some wonderful women. I have 2 beautiful daughters, and I've always had my health. I'm not going to spoil my last months by taking chemotherapy.
The elevator jerked to a halt and the doors drew apart. He pushed past his daughter and strode down the hall towards his room, afraid that she might see his tears. He had almost reached his door when she caught up with him, grabbing his arm and forcing him to face her. She was flushed, her face shining and wet.
"I'm sorry, Dad. I'm so sorry."
She drew a long, fibrillating breath.
"You're right. I was so obsessed with blaming you for everything, it never occurred to me there might be a time when you wouldn't be there. And who would I have to blame then?"
He put his arms around her and pulled her tightly to him, and she was just his little girl again, tiny and vulnerable and dependent. Her voice was muffled against his chest.
"You asked me last night if I'd forgiven you, and I said no. Well, I was wrong. I just realized, for the first time in my life, there's nothing to forgive."
He felt her body racked by sobs.
"I don't want you to die."
At the far end of the corridor, elevator doors opened, and Raffin stood looking down the hallway at father and daughter in each other's arms. Chapter 14. They headed north and west out of the city in the BMW that Raffin had rented. The slip road from the D263 took them on to the A4 for Paris. There were signposts to places like Agonau, Karlsruhe, Saarbrücken, ghost names from a German past, punctuating an Alsatian landscape where men had fought and died for the right to fly a flag, and pay their taxes to another master. Enzo lounged in the back, watching the dull November landscape slide past, grey and misty and damp. He would never see another spring, or ever again feel the warmth of the summer sun. If he could have chosen a time to die, it would not have been in winter. Kirsty sat in a brittle silence in the passenger seat, hands clasped tightly between her legs. There didn't seem anything left to say. They were about 2 kilometres from the Gare de Péage, where tickets were dispensed for the toll portion of the autoroute, when they hit a tailback. Vehicles backed up all the way from the rows of booths strung across the highway ahead. Raffin shifted down to second gear, and they crawled slowly forward through the exhaust fumes. It was Raffin, finally, who broke the silence. He half turned towards Enzo.
"So why do you think you're the target for all this merde?" "Because there's too much going on with only one thing in common, and that's you."
Enzo nodded.
"What else connects an attempt to kill Kirsty with the burning down of Bertrand's gym? A robbery in a park with the cutting off of my credit?"
Kirsty turned in her seat, her face a mask of incomprehension.
"But why? What's the point?"
"I can only think of one reason."
Raffin was watching him in the rear-view mirror.
"Which is?"
"Your book."
He saw Raffin's eyes crinkle incredulously.
"What are you talking about? You researched and wrote about 7 unsolved murders, right?" "I don't see the relevance. Given the media coverage we've had, there can't be anyone in France who doesn't know that I'm engaged in trying to solve those murders, including the killers."
Kirsty said,
"You think it's one of the murderers who's done all this?"
"Of Roger's 7 cases, I've cracked 2 in the last couple of years. If you were one of the remaining 5, wouldn't you be starting to feel a little insecure?"
Raffin said,
"But why wouldn't he just kill you?" "Someone already tried at Gaillac, but that was before I caught the killer there. If someone were to assassinate me now, it would seem pretty obvious that it was one of the remaining murderers, and someone else might start going after them. But if he just wrecks my life, takes it apart piece by piece, my investigations will simply stop, and it's highly unlikely that anyone else is going to step in to fill my shoes."
They lapsed again into silence, absorbing Enzo's theory, picking at its flaws, unravelling its frayed edges to see if it would still hang together. Then it was Enzo who broke the silence once more.
"If only he'd known I was going to die anyway, he wouldn't have had to bother."
They were approaching the toll booths now, and beyond the lines of traffic ahead, saw for the first time what was causing the tailback. There was a phalanx of blue gendarmerie vans parked off to one side, and 20 or more gendarmes checking papers before allowing anyone through the booths. They wore tall kepi hats and waterproof capes to protect them from the rain, nervous hands never far from holstered guns.
"Must be a terrorist alert,"
Raffin said. It was unusual for every car to be stopped for a simple traffic check. As they approached the head of their line, it became clear that the gendarmes were carrying out identity checks on all the occupants of every car, driver and passengers alike. Raffin fumbled for his ID card, and Kirsty took out her passport. Enzo found his carte de séjour and flipped it absently between his fingers, brooding still on the man who had so nearly killed his daughter just to ruin his life. Whichever of the 5 remaining killers he might be, Enzo's investigations to find him would no longer revolve around a professional re-examination of the evidence. This was personal, and he didn't have much time. Raffin drew up, and 3 gendarmes peered in through wet glass. He rolled down the driver's window and held out his ID card, but the gendarme was looking beyond him, towards the back seat. He flicked a quick glance at his colleagues, and one of them opened the rear passenger door and drew his gun in one swift movement. "Hey!" Raffin turned in alarm to see Enzo being pulled bodily from the car. He turned back to find a pistol pointed at his face.
"Out of the car! Everyone out of the car!"
Suddenly all the gendarmes were shouting at once. There came the sound of feet running through the wet, men in dark blue crowding around their car, Raffin and Kirsty dragged roughly out into the rain. Kirsty saw her father face down on the tarmac, 5 gendarmes around him. His arms were pulled behind his back, and she heard the snap of handcuffs locking in place. It all happened so fast, there was no time even to think about it. But now she screamed as loud as she could, before being spun around and banged up against the car. All the breath was knocked from her lungs, and she couldn't even find a voice to raise in protest, but she could hear Raffin's angry admonitions.
"What the hell do you think you're doing? I'm a journalist."
And the voice that replied, tight with tension,
"So maybe you'd like to tell us why you have a killer in the back of your car."
Part 2. Chapter 15. South of France, June 1986. Richard had mixed memories of the place. He had hated school. In those days it had been on the Rue de la Démocratie, opposite the Boulodrome and the beach, with a view out across the bay to the red-roofed Église Notre-Dame des Anges, with its distinctive Byzantine bell tower. There was something not quite right about being stuck in a classroom with all that blue Mediterranean on the other side of the glass. On fine days, when stormy seas allowed, he would follow the stone quay beneath the towering walls of the Château Royal to the Quai de la Morite, where yellow and blue-painted sailboats with their crooked crossed masts bumped and creaked and strained against the swell, a quayscape made famous by the paintings of André Derain. He would lean on the railings and watch the commandos training, streaming out from the chateau into the water in full kit to launch rubber dinghies into the bay. Sometimes they would be taken out beyond the harbour wall and tipped overboard to make their own way back to shore. With his home in the Rue Bellevue being almost directly below Fort Miradoux, he had grown up with the sight of soldiers in the street. He had always admired the way they carried themselves, and how their hair was cropped, and the green khaki of their uniforms above shiny black boots. It was here, perhaps, that the seeds of later ambition had been sown. With his home in the Rue Bellevue being almost directly below Fort Miradoux, he had grown up with the sight of soldiers in the street. He had always admired the way they carried themselves, and how their hair was cropped, and the green khaki of their uniforms above shiny black boots. It was here, perhaps, that the seeds of later ambition had been sown. The Rue Bellevue was aptly named, running along the cliff-tops above the old town, looking out to sea. He lived with his mother at the end of a row of stone cottages at the far end of the street. When it was stormy, the house took a battering. When it wasn't, he would spend hours perched on the rocks at the end of the garden, watching the sea break against the cliffs below. There was a time when he was bullied at school, until he jabbed a pencil into the eye of the school bully and nearly blinded him. No one had come near him after that. It had been the beginning of the end of the relationship with his mother. There had never been any love lost between them. She had been unbearably protective, smothering him with a love that had been suffocating and selfish, and as he grew into his teens he had become rebellious, argumentative, disobedient. Their relationship finally had been fatally fractured when she'd had his dog put down. It had been done at her insistence after he'd suffered a severe allergic reaction which nearly killed him. It had been inexplicable. Domi and Richard had been best friends for 5 years, ever since his mother had brought the dog home as a puppy. Richard had never once suffered a reaction in all that time, but the doctor had said that almost anything could trigger an allergy. Richard had never believed it was Domi. Not then. Not till later. But that came after the discovery that would shake his life to its very foundations. He was due to sit his baccalaureate the week he found out, which is why he never took the exam. His mother had been out somewhere, and he was studying, or at least trying to. But he'd been distracted by the sunshine, bright light coruscating like scattered diamonds across the deep blue waters of the bay. Looking back, he could never remember what had drawn him to the attic. Boredom, probably. It was years since he had been up there, in the dust and the heat. A bright slash of sunlight falling from the skylight lay across the forgotten junk of a lifetime in dazzling, jagged splinters, and it was amongst that junk that he found his mother's old trunk and its treasure of family memorabilia, the detritus of a life he knew nothing about. His father was dead. She had told him that much, but she had never spoken of grandparents, or siblings, or cousins, or aunts and uncles, and here were photographs of people he had never seen, family albums filled with fuzzy black and white prints, faded names written in English in an old-fashioned hand: Grandfather Pegler, Granny Tops, Aunt Hilda, Selina and Frank. Richard looked at unfamiliar faces staring back at him from a long-forgotten past. Of course, he knew his mother was English. It was the language she had insisted they always speak in the house, but it had never occurred to him that there might still be family back in England. The pictures in the album, however, were from another era, and these folk, at least, were long dead. He rummaged through the trunk and found a pack of coloured photographs that looked as if they might have been taken in his lifetime. He squinted at the top picture and saw the date burned red into the bottom corner of the photograph by the developer. 230770. He shuffled through the photographs. Views across a bay to white Mediterranean houses clinging to a steep hillside leading to a large church, a jumble of rooftops, red terracotta Roman tiles, shops along a seafront, posters in Spanish promoting a local corrida. This was Spain. Then a family on a beach, a mother and father and 3 children. They were posing for a photograph, smiling at the camera, but not the one that took this photograph. There was an unseen photographer somewhere off to camera right. There were 2 boys and a girl. The boys were little more than toddlers. The girl was about 5. One of the boys had his head turned away, and the other was looking straight towards the lens that had captured his image, straight towards Richard. If it was possible that your heart could stop, and yet you could go on living, Richard would have said that his heart had stopped, because there was absolutely no doubt in his mind. He was looking at himself, and in some very strange way he was almost able to conjure a recollection of the moment. But even stranger was that none of these other people was familiar. He flipped quickly through the other photographs, but that was the only one of the group on the beach. He was unsettled. Who were these people? His mother had never spoken of a holiday in Spain. He put the photographs aside and delved deeper into the trunk, finding a worn leather document holder. He opened it up to find a collection of yellowing family papers, extracts from the register of births, marriages, and deaths. There was his mother's birth certificate, Selina Ann Pegler, born 19th May, 1939. A certificate of marriage to his father, Reginald Archangel, on September 9th, 1964. Then his father's death certificate, dated just 6 months before the birth of his son in September 1968. Beneath that was his own birth certificate, September 20th. He looked at the entry for his father, which described him simply as schoolmaster, and wondered briefly what he had been like. But he quickly put away the thought. It made no difference now. He slipped the final certificate out of its plastic sleeve, and everything he had ever thought he knew about himself fell headlong into a place of impenetrable darkness. In trembling hands he held a death certificate of an 18-month-old boy who had died from heart failure on March 18th, 1970. The boy's name was Richard Archangel. It was his own death certificate. Chapter 16. The mist and cloud which had hung over Cahors for days had finally lifted. A winter sun hung low in the clearest of blue skies, banishing the dreary November damp and replacing it with cold, crisp air. Enzo could see cracks of sunlight around the edges of shutters closed firmly on the barred windows of his interrogation room, somewhere in the bowels of the caserne. It was a small room, walls scarred by graffiti, witness to the hundreds of prisoners who had spent time here under the harsh glare of fluorescent light, claiming innocence, just like him. The police had heard it all before. Enzo was restless, like a caged animal. He couldn't stay in his seat for more than a few minutes at a time, prowling the room, angry and depressed, in desperate search of a way out of all this. The gendarmes had told him nothing, treating him like a criminal already tried and convicted by the courts. He had remained handcuffed during the long 11-hour journey back to Cahors in the back of a darkened van, cramped and uncomfortable, allowed out only twice to relieve himself at the side of the road, blinded by the sudden daylight. Now, after a night in the cells of the Police Nationale in Cahors, he faced the woman he had once considered as a prospective lover. Commissaire Taillard was still an attractive woman, silky brown hair tied in a bun at the back of her head, to reveal a strong, faintly Slavic face with high cheekbones and gently slanted almond eyes. Her dark cherry-red lips were full, and set in an unaccustomed line of genuine gravitas as she gazed at him with dark, disappointed eyes across the interrogation desk. He tried to remember why it was they had never quite hit it off. On the face of it, they'd had a lot in common. The local chief of police, and a man who had once been a top forensic scientist in his native Scotland. They had dated on a number of occasions. She had been his partner on invitations to several dinner parties. People had begun to talk about them as a couple, to speculate. Oddly, he had preferred her in uniform. Out of it, there was something strangely old-fashioned about her, and although she was a passionate woman, she had failed to arouse the same degree of passion in him. Perhaps, had they consummated their relationship with sex, that might have changed. They had come close one night after dinner at his apartment. Things had advanced to a state of semi-undress when Sophie returned with Bertrand, catching them in flagrante delicto, an inconvenient and embarrassing coitus interruptus that they somehow never managed to complete on any future occasion. He supposed it was he who had let the relationship wither. Not a conscious decision, just a gradual retreat, and he had the sense that she somehow blamed him. Now he was being forced to deal with her on quite a different basis, and the presence of the armed officer guarding the door precluded the possibility of any communication between them on a personal one. He wanted to say, "For God's sake, Helene, it's me, you know I'm not capable of anything like this," but all he said was, "It's absurd, Commissaire, completely insane." "Do you deny knowing her?" "Of course not. I met Odeline at a party about 6 weeks ago. I've seen her a few times since." Commissaire Taillard consulted an open folder on the table in front of her. "You had dinner together last week at the Fils des Douceurs floating restaurant." Enzo flicked her a look. It was where he and Helene had first dined alone together, but she was impassive. "Yes." "Were you having sex?" Enzo felt himself flush with unaccustomed embarrassment. It seemed like such a bald question on such a personal matter, especially coming from a woman with whom he had failed to become intimate. He glanced at the officer guarding the door, but if he had thoughts on the subject, his face did not betray them. He decided on flippancy. "Not during dinner." It felt as if the temperature in the room had dropped 10 degrees. He revised his approach. "How is that relevant?" "There may have been a sexual element to the attack, Monsieur MacLeod. The victim's blouse had been ripped open and her bra torn off, so the question is pertinent." Enzo closed his eyes. It was easy to forget as he drowned in a sea of his own troubles that a woman who had aroused feelings in him had been murdered, very probably because of him. He opened his eyes again to banish the unpleasant images that came to him in the dark. Commissaire Taillard still held him in her gaze. "Your emails were certainly of an intimate nature." So she had read their email exchanges. Enzo blushed in spite of himself. He should have known better than to commit his feelings to writing. But sometimes the Italian in him would overcome the natural reticence of the Scot. "No," he said. "No what?" "No, we weren't having sex." Still there was nothing in her expression to betray her emotions, but he noticed that her face, in contrast to the colour he felt rising on his own, had grown very pale. "What was the purpose of your visit to her apartment on the morning she was murdered?" "I wasn't at her apartment."
According to her computer diary, you had a rendezvous at her apartment at 11 a.m.
I can't help that. I wasn't there.
Where were you then? He hesitated.
I had an appointment with an oncologist.
She frowned. An oncologist?
A cancer specialist.
I know what an oncologist is. The unasked question got as far as her lips, but not beyond them. Where?
Here in Cahors.
And presumably this doctor will be able to bear that out?
Of course.
She seemed torn, as if somehow wanting to believe him and not, both at the same time.
You should know that the sample of your hair that we took on your arrival yesterday has been sent to Toulouse for comparison with several long black hairs recovered from the clothes of the deceased.
Enzo shrugged.
So they won't match.
He pulled up his chair suddenly and sat down opposite her, leaning forward with earnest intent.
Look, Helene, I've got a cast-iron alibi. A paper trail that leads all the way from my GP to the oncologist, and then the doctor himself at the end of it. Why don't we just follow that trail and put an end to this nonsense?
It was good to have the blue sky overhead, and fresh, cool air in his lungs again, even if only for a few moments. The police car pulled up outside Enzo's apartment, and a uniformed officer helped him out from the back seat. His hands were cuffed in front of him, and he caught a momentary glimpse of his reflection in the window of the L'Empereur restaurant. They had taken away his hairband, although the notion that he might have tried to hang himself with it seemed more than faintly absurd, so his hair was a straggling mess tumbling over his shoulders. He hadn't shaved in 2 days. His jacket was stained and dirty from where they had pinned him down on the wet tarmac. He saw the faces of people he knew, shopkeepers, neighbours, regulars at the restaurant, turning to watch with shocked curiosity as he was led by a uniformed officer to the door of the stairwell. Commissaire Taillard followed stiffly in their wake, a woman of authority on public display. On the first landing she rang the doorbell and waited. There was no reply. She looked at Enzo as if he could explain why there was no one at home. He just shrugged, and she took his keys and unlocked the door. As they went into the hallway, Enzo saw through the open door of the spare bedroom Kirsty's valise on the unmade bed, and Raffin's distinctive soft leather overnight bag on the chest of drawers. So, they were sharing a room. In the séjour he crossed to his desk and began searching through his papers. He had tossed his letter of appointment into a wire tray where he placed documents awaiting filing. He had no idea where to file it, or if he ever would, but it wasn't there. It should have been on top of the heap. He lifted out the untidy pile of miscellaneous bills and letters and shuffled through them with an increasing sense of alarm.
It's gone.
The letter from your GP?
Commissaire Taillard was looking at him sceptically.
Yes.
The one with the date and time of your appointment with the oncologist?
Yes.
How very convenient.
It's not at all convenient. Maybe Sophie or Kirsty took it.
Enzo could feel the colour rising on his cheeks.
Look, why don't we just cut straight to the chase? If you just take me to see the oncologist, that puts an end to it once and for all.
She sighed, patience stretching to its limit.
What was it you were seeing him for?
Enzo's eyes dipped away towards the floor. Only Kirsty and Roger knew the truth, and each time he had been forced to say it out loud, it just seemed to compound its inevitability.
"I've got terminal cancer," he said,
and looked up to see the shock in her face. The Rue des Trois Baudus looked different in the sunshine. In Enzo's memory it had been a very dark place. Now sunlight spilled down between the buildings, bringing colour to brick walls and painted shutters. They had walked up the Rue du Château du Roi from the Place de la Libération, where the police driver had parked. The assistant in the music store had waved as they passed, but his hand had frozen in mid-air when he saw that Enzo was in handcuffs. Sunshine struck the building at the far end of the Rue des Trois Baudus, where it took a right-angled turn to the left out into the Rue de Portail-Albin. Even the graffiti in black and purple seemed more decorative than defacing. They stopped outside the pale oak door of number 24 bis. The window to the left was still shuttered and barred, but the oncologist's plaque had been removed. leaving only 4 small screw holes in the wall to bear witness to its ever having been there. Enzo stared at the blank space in confusion. The boîte postale to the right of the door was stuffed to overflowing with publicité.
"Is this it?"
Commissaire Taillard was beginning to lose patience. Enzo tried to stay calm.
Yes, there was a plaque on the wall right here. The doctor's name was Gilbert Doucier, and there was a sign below the bell push saying, "Ring and enter."
But there was no sign there now. Commissaire Taillard pressed the bell push, and they were greeted by silence.
"Sounds like it might have been out of commission for some time," she said.
Enzo lifted his chained hands and made fists to bang on the door. There was no response.
"I'm not lying."
He turned towards her troubled gaze.
"This is where I was the morning Odeline was murdered. This is where Dr. Doucier had his cabinet."
He shrugged in frustration.
"He must have moved." "What's all the damned noise down there?"
A voice rang out from above, and they all swung their heads up to see an elderly woman leaning from a window on the first floor opposite. She had thrown her shutters wide and was so pale you might have thought she had not seen daylight in months.
"Police,"
the commissaire said.
"Who occupies this property here at 24 bis?"
The woman looked down at them as if they were mad.
"No one. Place has been empty for a couple of years."
"There was a doctor's surgery here,"
Enzo called up to her.
"A Dr. Doucier."
"No,"
the old woman shook her head.
"Never been a doctor here in all my time, and I was born in this house."
Enzo felt the world falling away beneath his feet. The certainty that had fueled him was dissolving into bewilderment and confusion. He turned to meet his nearly lover's cold stare. Her cell phone rang and she put it to her ear.
"Commissaire Taillard?"
She listened in silence for a long time, then,
"Thank you,"
she said, and hung up. Her eyes never left Enzo's.
"Well, well, well. It seems that the sample of hair that we took from you yesterday matches the hair found on the body."
She pursed her lips. All sympathy and willingness to believe him long since vanished.
"What do you suggest we do now?"
Clément Marot had been a 15th-century French poet, a protégé of Marguerite de Navarre, the sister of the then King François I. A famous son of Cahors, it seemed slightly insulting to have named such a mean little square after him. You might pass it without noticing, but it was through a large arched portail on its northeast corner that Enzo's GP had his practice, in a building shared by several notaires. His receptionist said that Dr. Julliard was with a patient and that they would have to wait, so the 2 police officers and a dishevelled Enzo sat in the crowded waiting room for more than 10 minutes, studiously avoiding the openly curious stares of patients awaiting their appointments. When, finally, the receptionist showed him into his surgery, Dr. Julliard rose, startled, from his desk. He looked at Enzo in disbelief.
"Good God, man, what's happened to you?"
Commissaire Taillard said,
"Monsieur MacLeod is being questioned in connection with a murder which took place in the town 3 days ago."
"No."
Dr. Julliard could not conceal his disbelief.
"Monsieur